Do you see them now?
No.
Do you Okay, good. All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction's Friday Forum for Friday, October the 20th, 2023. I'm your host, ICLR Chief Engineer, Dr. Keith Porter. This is one in a monthly webinar series hosted by ICLR, Canada's leading source for disaster resilience knowledge. Each month, we present recently completed research or other useful knowledge related to ICLR's mission to make Canada more disaster resilient. Last time, we brought you Brenna Meisenhall, who spoke about the accumulated damage from high concentrations of small hail. Her slides and video are available at ICLR's website, www.iclr.org/workshops. Next time, on November 10th, Christian Messier will speak about how to increase the resilience of urban trees to climate change and other threats. Today's speakers are Becky Denlinger, Matthew Godsoe, and Veronica Scotti, who will speak about modernizing Canada's Disaster Financial Agreement Arrangement, or DFAA. Becky is a former firefighter serving on the board of directors of Oceans Networks Canada, and she's a visiting fellow here with us at Western University. She's been deputy minister and a fire commissioner. Veronica Scotti is an executive at Swiss Re, responsible for public sector solutions, and she used to serve on ICLR's board of directors. Matt is an expert on disaster resilience policy, currently serves as director of the Resilience and Economics Integration Division at Public Safety Canada. Before our speakers begin, here's our agenda. Our webinar will last 90 minutes. Our speakers will present for about half that time, then I'll moderate Q&A for the rest of the time. Please feel free to chat your questions in the Q&A box. I will pose your questions in the order they appear in the Q&A box. If we have a lot of questions, I may only pose your first question, then move on to others, then circle back to your additional questions. Our webinar is recorded. ICLR will post our speakers' slides and a link to the video on Monday or so. So if you have colleagues who could not attend, please let them know. And with that, I want to turn the floor over to Becky Denlinger. Take it away, Becky.
Thanks, Keith. Hi, everybody. I'm joining you from beautiful Victoria, British Columbia, and glad to be here today. I'm going to set the stage and give you a little bit of background about the Disaster Financial Assistance Agreement Advisory Panel members, the findings and the recommendations. And then I'll bring in Dr. Godsoe from Public Safety Canada to talk about what government's been doing with the recommendations that came from this panel report, and to Veronica Scotti, who served with me as a panel member. And I think she's probably known to many of you, but she's going to speak to her experience on the panel and how it relates to her work in the insurance industry. In March of last year, 2022, the Honorable Bill Blair, who at the time was president of the Privy Council and Minister of Emergency Preparedness, he convened an expert advisory panel to review Canada's approach to post-disaster financing and to ask us to make recommendations for how the DFAA program could evolve to be a more relevant, effective, and sustainable mechanism for disaster recovery, for risk reduction and resilience, all in the context of the rising frequency, impacts, and costs of disasters. Next slide, please, Keith. The panel members included 8 people with expert experience in the public and private sectors, Indigenous governance, academia, and the not-for-profit sector. It met throughout the spring and summer of 2022. We reviewed published literature, policy documents. We heard from a lot of academic experts and from key stakeholders, including representatives from national Indigenous organizations and provinces and territories. If you could go to my third slide, Keith, please. Whoops, wrong deck.
Wrong deck, I beg your pardon.
Yeah.
Is this on yours?
Yeah, and skip the next one, and I'll go to the third one. Thanks. Think how much better this would be if I did it myself, but I asked Keith to handle this part for me. Sorry, Keith.
Right.
The panel's final report. Whoops.
Right.
There you
Sorry.
go. The panel's final report was released in April of this year, 2023, and it contains 7 recommendations that relate directly to the disaster financial assistance arrangement. In the course of the panel's work, we found that we were reaching consensus on issues that related to mitigating risk, but not directly on our mandate as well. So we couldn't help ourselves. Our focus expanded to include ideas that were beyond the scope of the DFAA itself. So we sought and received permission from government to add recommendations that were beyond the scope of DFAA. And I want to commend government for engaging us in the first place. They provided us excellent support in the form of the Public Safety Canada staff led by Dr. Godsoe. They provided an outside consultant to facilitate, record, and summarize the discussions, and that was enormously helpful. And also for allowing us to broaden the scope of our inquiry to include additional suggestions for building forward together to create a more resilient Canada. I'm sure most of you have already had a chance to look at the recommendations. I want to point out here one of the concepts that came forward in these 7 recommendations that were directly related to the DFAA program. Item number 2 there is a new concept for DFAA, and that is recommending that a pre-disaster transfer program be created separate from the DFAA funding stream to support the reduction of risk through mitigation prior to a disaster. As we know, de-risking the highest risk in advance is more cost-effective than waiting for the disaster to strike. It reduces the impacts of the disasters on human lives and economic vitality, and enables the insurance sector to function effectively, especially in the highest risk areas. Next slide, please, Keith. On this slide, which are items 5, 6, and 7 related to the DFAA program, it's recommendation 6 that I wanted to highlight, which includes the recommendation to create a team of experts that can be deployed to jurisdictions requiring immediate assistance and support. And you can imagine, having served as Deputy Minister of Emergency Management in British Columbia, I'm especially fond of this recommendation. We have so many very small communities that have been met with extreme events. This is an enormously useful concept, and I look forward to the possibility of it being implemented. Next slide, please. As I said, we sought and received permission to add recommendations beyond the DFAA itself, and the final report contains these 3 further recommendations that are focused on broader resilient efforts for government to consider. Since the release of the report, government has been meeting with provinces, territories, and First Nations to discuss the recommendations. And Matt Godsoe has been leading those discussions. He's put a lot of travel in over the preceding half year or so, and he's joining us today to tell us about that work and where government is on the implementation of the recommendations and consideration of those that precedes it. Veronica Scotti also served on the advisory panel, as I mentioned, and she'll give some insight into her experiences related to this work. So, Matt, I give you the floor.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Becky. I should start by just noting that I'm here in Ottawa on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe, and certainly am very pleased to be able to live and work here. And it was myself and my team who were providing the secretariat services to the panel, to Becky and Veronica, during the course of that work. And it was a great pleasure and an honor to be able to be a part of it. And it's now my team that is responsible for figuring out how to translate those fantastic recommendations into reality across vastly different provinces and territories with different hazards and different levels of capacity and different concerns. And that's a lot of the work that we've been focused on since the panel report was completed and subsequently released in 2023. What I'd like to do is just provide a little bit more context on where the federal government is coming from and some of the other inputs that have gone into the review of the Disaster Financial Assistance Arrangements Program. and then go through how hopefully we've been able to take a lot of those ideas from the panel and from the other streams of work in the modernization process. And we're starting to translate those into what we hope are progress in the right direction, noting that the new terms and conditions for a new version of the Disaster Financial Assistance Arrangements Program will be coming out by the end of this fiscal year, with implementation April 1, 2025. So we'll talk a little bit more about those dates, but just to put that caveat up front, that we are still working through the policy development process. We jump to the next slide, please, Keith. This one just points out what is a fact that I assume is just intuitive to everyone, and that is that the world has changed pretty significantly in the world of disaster risk reduction since 1970, when the program was initially established. And the program has a $100 million a year budget. We're now about an order of magnitude overspent every year. And frankly, the program worked pretty well until the mid-1990s. And then we did see this sort of fundamental tipping point in our national disaster risk profile. We're starting with the Saguenay River flood in 1996, the Red River flood in 1997, the ice storm in 1998, and basically every year since then, we've had large-scale disasters in excess of $500 million in adjusted losses, just happening year over year. And in the last decade, we've seen on average these large-scale, at least billion-dollar losses happening virtually every year as well. So we are seeing these nonlinear increases in our disaster risk. And what that has done to the DFAA program is taken it from a program that looked like it was a well-adjusted program for the risk environment to a program where every year we're putting on Band-Aids and bubble gum on the terms and conditions to make it better fit our new context. And now the program is mostly Band-Aids and bubble gum. So it really is about trying to peel off those layers and take a look at the program from scratch. And we'll talk more momentarily about how it is that we're proposing to do that. We'll go to the next slide, please, Keith. In addition to the changes in our disaster risk profile, there's also just been other major drivers of change that have impacts on how we experience disasters. And those include population growth, urbanization, climate change, obviously, the interconnectivity and interdependence of our critical infrastructure and supply chains, the aging infrastructure and the gap in infrastructure investments. And I think if you click one more time, Keith, it may pop up another portion of the list. There we go. And that does lead to the increasing frequency and severity of events, as well as a whole host of other issues, including insurance and housing costs continuing to increase, and a real challenge in trying to figure out the best ways to position adapting to climate change and increasing disaster risk across all actors in Canadian society, not just across federal, provincial, and territorial governments, but also how we're interfacing with the private sector, with individual Canadians, NGOs, Indigenous communities. All of those things are very much shifting under our feet as we're moving forward. We can jump to the next slide, please. Becky already mentioned what the objective of the DFAA review was. And that really was about trying to use this as a tool to increase the coherence and increase our impact in disaster risk reduction across the entirety of the emergency management system. So not just in disaster recovery, but is this a tool that we may be able to better leverage to increase, as I mentioned, the coherency, the efficacy, the sustainability of disaster risk reduction across Canada. So there were three streams of work that went into the review. The first one was an internal audit and evaluation that was conducted by federal auditors and evaluators, as well as my team sort of combing through the last 50 years of data to see what that told us about the program, when things have changed, and whether those changes were done in the context of the entirety of the program and the entirety of the emergency management system, or really done just with an eye to the terms and conditions of this program, and how those decisions may have led to different unintended consequences in outcomes after disasters. The internal audit and evaluation report was published last fall, and it is available on Public Safety Canada's website if anyone's interested in seeing what their findings were. Secondly, there's been significant engagement with provinces and territories. So we operate the federal DFAA, but every province and territory has their own parallel program, and the funding flows straight from the federal government into those provincial and territorial programs. So they obviously have a real vested interest in being partners with us on the journey of modernization, because it has such a significant impact on their programs as well. There was lots of engagement to begin with, but in particular, after the publication of the panel report, we've gone on a bit of a roadshow, going to 12 of 13 provincial and territorial capitals and meeting with over 150 officials from provincial and territorial governments across a range of ministries, just to help them understand the findings of the review, to seek their feedback on how we might be able to work together to shape the new program, and to really try to set up an implementation plan that's going to work well for the federal government and for provinces and territories, and hopefully all Canadians as well. And then the third piece of work was the advisory panel and its report. And if you think about kind of increasing scope, the audit and evaluation really was looking retrospectively at the dollars and cents of the program. The provincial and territorial engagement mostly dealt with tweaks to the existing construct of the program. And the advisory panel was sort of issued this, if you could start from scratch, what would you do differently? How might we be able to look at this with fresh eyes in a much more strategic way? And how might those findings enable us to modernize the program and really significantly shift the landscape in disaster risk reduction? We can jump to the next slide, please. So with all of that in mind, we did get some areas of scope that we knew were going to remain consistent with the modernized program. So these are the things that are not changing with the new program that will be coming forward in 2025. The first one is the legislative authority for the program is going to continue to be the Emergency Management Act. And the provinces and territories will continue to be the only eligible recipient for the program. And so that enables them to tailor their own programs to the specific context within their jurisdictions. The second is that the program intent will continue to be for the federal government to provide financial assistance for disaster costs that exceed what provinces and territories can reasonably be expected to bear on their own, and that the initial threshold to get into this program will continue to be based on a per capita funding formula. So that part, getting in the front door of the program, is going to be the same on the first day of the new program as it has been today. The last piece where there was no ability for us to shift the scope was that this will continue to be focused only on natural hazards. So we know that there are other places like technological hazards or industrial accidents where we're also seeing different impacts. As well as health events, those continue to not be covered under the DFAA. There are separate federal programs that enable us to be able to play in those spaces. So that's what's not changing after the review. We go to the next slide, please. Here's the high-level policy direction that came out from the review that we received back from the federal government. So the first one is a real desire to target federal funding in building resilience, in reducing risk, and supporting those people who are most impacted by disasters, with a particular emphasis on vulnerable populations. The second piece of high-level guidance that we got back was a need to enable building back to climate and disaster resilient guidelines instead of just pre-disaster conditions. So ensuring that we're not building back the same vulnerability in the same places. And then also a need to create incentives for risk reduction and mitigation to go beyond what has been in place so far. And we can talk a little bit about some of the maladaptation in incentives between the existing pre and post disaster funding programs at the federal level. Underpinning all of this has also been a commitment to try to modernize the processes and seek administrative efficiencies in the delivery of the program as well. So this is sort of the high level direction that we received from the government after those three streams of the DFAA review were received. We'll move now into how we're trying to translate this into actionable pieces and actionable changes in the program. So if we just jump to the next slide, please. So getting a little bit more precise in what our intentions are. The first one is that we're proposing a new program that's going to be based on expense type as opposed to total cost share. And I'll go through these at a high level now, and then we can unpack each slide by slide. So the new program will be based on expense type rather than a flat rate of cost sharing across all of the different kinds of expenses that provinces and territories incur. The second one is that we're expanding and modernizing definitions and eligibility to try to line up the program with how provinces and territories and local governments define many of the relevant features of eligibility, including small businesses, temporary housing, length and types of social supports that are available to survivors of disasters. The third is that we are looking to, just as a matter of course, make reconstruction to climate and disaster resilient guidelines a regular expenditure. So as it stands right now in the program, for those of you who may not be familiar, a lot of the program only builds back to pre-disaster conditions, and any mitigative enhancements or resilience enhancements that might be desired come into a different section of the program that is designed for mitigation. We're hoping to roll that up so we're getting into a program that is resilient by default, rather than forcing provinces and territories to pick where they want to make their mitigation investments between things that are being rebuilt and maybe more forward-looking and strategic mitigation investments. We still want to support those more strategic investments in mitigation, and so we're looking for a higher percentage and more flexibility in funding those kind of high return on investment, maybe larger scale and strategic risk reduction measures. We're also looking to remove some of the burden from repetitive claims under provinces by recognizing pre-disaster investments in disaster risk reduction with sort of a pre-threshold, almost like a rebate, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a second. And then finally seeking to, again, ensure that we're not building back the same vulnerabilities in the same place. So where we're able to identify high-risk flood zones, attaching more conditionality to ensure that when those things are built back, either they're going to be built back in ways that are resilient to future events, or they may become ineligible for the program. So really trying to, again, use this to incentivize risk reduction and mitigation measures. We'll go to the next slide, please. So let's start by looking at the new program type. The current program is on a sliding scale based on the total costs of the disaster. So for the first $3.61 of per capita eligible costs for a disaster, the province bears all of that cost. And then as the costs increase, and you can see what the increments of increase are, the federal cost share also increases up to 90 cents in the dollar. There's some advantage to this kind of program construct because it does make the administration a little bit more streamlined, but it does treat all types of post-disaster investments the same. And when we know that we need to be trying to pull the levers to incentivize more risk reduction, more resilience building, and more mitigation, it really doesn't give us the tools to be able to do that. So if you look on the right-hand side of the slide here, instead of having everything cost shared at the same level, we'd be looking at the types of expenses that are being incurred. And as we get into the kinds of expenses that we collectively as federal, provincial, and territorial governments decide are the ones that garner the highest return on investment or the highest priority for us, we would apply a higher cost sharing percentage. So you can imagine things like support for vulnerable populations, support for forward-looking risk reduction and mitigation measures could be at the high end of those cost sharing percentages, so that we can use this as a more strategic tool to incentivize those kinds of building back better investments. The front door on the program in this case still stays the same, but once you're in the front door, you would also have certainty immediately, regardless of the size of the disaster, what the federal cost sharing percentage would be. So we think that that also begins to tidy up some of the administrative burden caused by the previous program construct. We'll go to the next slide, please. The next piece is modernizing definitions and eligibility. So it really is about looking across the country and trying to figure out how either the way that the previous terms and conditions were written or the definitions that had been in that program construct for 50 years in some cases were really just not keeping up with the world that we live in. So we've gone through all of the different definitions that are in there with the help of provinces and territories and really tried to tidy those up. Again, with an emphasis on the things that we know are most effective in disaster risk reduction, building resilience, mental health support, support for high risk and vulnerable populations, and really just trying to provide as much clarity as we could. One of the things that we learned in our cross-Canada tour over the course of the summer is that sometimes what is being audited based on where a comma sits in the terms and conditions of the program is having a really material impact on what the post-disaster outcomes are in communities. And we like to ensure that it's the intent of the program, it's the policy objectives of the program that are dictating what is being audited, which is having an impact on what's actually happening on the ground, not sort of a fluke of writing in the terms and conditions that is leading to the audits changing in unintended ways the outcomes that are happening for Canadians. We can go to the next slide, please, on the third change to the program. We're looking to enable reconstruction to climate and disaster resilient guidelines. So we know that there's a lag between when a new guideline comes out, when it might be incorporated into the National Building Code, and then once it's in the National Building Code, how long it may take to get into a provincial or territorial building code. And in some cases, that time horizon is a decade long. So we're looking to compress that as these new standards and guidelines are coming out, rather than waiting until they're baked into the building code, giving provinces and territories the flexibility to adapt those sooner and to build back to, by default, the kinds of build back standards that enable more resilience going forward. So if there is a guideline that exists for flood resilient rebuilds of residential properties, and it's been published by someone authoritative, either at the provincial level or federally or internationally, let's just treat that the same way as we're treating the building code so that we're building back resilient by default. This also opens up more flexibility and more space, as I mentioned previously, in the 15% mitigation area, so that they don't have to be forced between deciding whether they're going to build back better to damaged infrastructure, or maybe placing a dike or a dam or some other kind of community level risk reduction measure upstream. Let's give more flexibility to do the things that we know buy down risk in the long term. We can go to the following slide, please. The next one is higher and more flexibility, higher amounts and more flexibility for mitigation funding. So I mentioned again previously, right now you can have up to 15% costs for damaged infrastructure. So if you have $100 million worth of eligible infrastructure damage, you might have up to another 15%, so another $15 million of funding that you could put towards building those pieces of infrastructure back in ways that are more resilient. But largely that has to apply actually to the damaged infrastructure, which doesn't enable people to think creatively about how to manage the risk more broadly across the whole of their communities. And also in many cases, that 15% just isn't enough to have the kinds of impacts that we know we would like to have. And so even with the 15% mitigation in place, we wind up coming back to pay for buildings that were damaged in the past with the same type of hazards. So we really are looking to increase that mitigation percentage and enable much more flexibility for those kinds of community level investments that aren't just about the specific piece of infrastructure that was damaged, but maybe something else that has to be done upstream or outside the community that is just going to be more effective overall in reducing our collective risk long term. We'll go to the next slide, please. So we talked already about the construct of the program, and what I'm demonstrating here just on the right-hand side is we're also looking at once you're in the front door of the program, so you need to have a cost that exceeds $3.61 per capita to trigger the program. But once that program is triggered, we're also looking to see if there's not some way that we might be able to recognize smart investments by provinces and territories by giving them a bit of a rebate, which I'm not allowed to call a rebate for that initial deductible that they put forward into the program. So really trying to say, once you have that damage that triggers the program, that's fine, and you get in and access to the expense streams as described on the first element here. But let's also see if we can't recognize where you've made smart investments, where you've updated land use planning guidelines, where you've made investments in disaster mapping and modeling, where you've done other things that have also helped to buy down the risk. So we can continue to incentivize people to make those decisions before disasters happen. Because we want to try to ensure that we're not providing really generous post-disaster recovery funding, while not also recognizing the frankly more effective risk reduction measures that can be done well in advance of a disaster. You can go to the next piece, the next slide, please. So here's the last change, and this is really about advances in technology that are giving us a much better view on where flood risk in particular is across the country. But this also extends to other perils as we get better and better at these global and national level models that show us where the risk exists. We can start to be much more stringent in saying, we don't want to build back the same kinds of vulnerability in the same places. Let's talk together about where the highest risk areas are. Let's make sure that when there are high risk areas, as people are building back, we're prioritizing building back ways that are protected. And if they're not protected, then let's talk about the ways in which we might have to exclude people from future support in those areas so that we can, again, work together to prioritize protecting those at highest risk and not continuing to pay back severe repetitive loss in the same places over and over again, which isn't cost effective for any level of government, but also fundamentally isn't fair for those who are repeatedly impacted by those disasters over and over. We can go to the following slide, please. I'll just give you a little bit of a snapshot on the timelines that I mentioned at the outset. The first one is obviously, given the crucial role that provinces and territories play in the implementation of this program, we're continuing to have ongoing conversations, both in plenary with provinces and territories and also bilaterally to make sure that we're getting the best information and we're keeping them abreast of all of the changes that we're proposing so that they can continue to be ready with their programs as we move this forward. We've also begun outreach to a number of different academic and NGO partners on elements of the modernization, just to help make sure that we're not missing something. That maybe as public sector workers in provincial and territorial and federal governments, we think something is going to go in one direction, but we've just missed some portion of the equation. So we are going back and testing those assumptions and sharing some of these design elements with those members or with those communities to try to ensure that we're not making any mistakes. I mean, we'll make some, but try to minimize those to the extent that's possible. We'll be finalizing the new program guidelines and terms and conditions towards early to mid 2024. So our objective is to have this done for March, to be transparent, so that April 1st, 2024, we will have certainty about what the new program looks like, and provinces and territories will have a full 12 months for their changes that they need to make, and for us to go back and forth with them to clarify and train and ensure that we can be as ready as possible April 1, 2025. Just jump to the next slide, please. And this one I'll just speak to very quickly, which is to say that this is all happening in the context of other elements of our disaster risk and flood risk management systems. And we are working to try to increase alignment across these initiatives among many others. So it's not just the DFAA sitting on its own, it's the DFAA being designed in a way which is really systems-based and linked back to things like the Emergency Management Assistance Program, which is also being updated for First Nations communities on reserve. It's working closely between the DFAA and the flood insurance solution that's being proposed for residential flood insurance in high-risk areas across the country, ensuring that there's a clear interface and clear communications approach through a flood risk portal initially, but looking at a portal that enables us to mobilize a lot of that new modeling information and get it in the hands of Canadians and Canadian businesses. And then, as I mentioned, just working really hand in glove with other initiatives that are working in the climate adaptation space. So anywhere that we can increase coherence across the federal government, that's really our main objective. So like I said, it's not the DFAA being updated on an island. It really is an entire systems-based approach that we're trying to implement to build that coherence and build the efficacy, because the problems are getting very, very big, and the amount of money that's available to solve them is not growing in step. We need to make sure that we're leveraging all of these different kinds of incentives as effectively as possible. With that, I think I'm a minute or two over, and I apologize, but I'll maybe go to the last slide, which if I remember correctly, is just questions, and I'll kick it over to Veronica to pick up from there.
Give me just a second to bring up
That's perfect, Keith. Thank you so much, Matt. And you could have slowed down as well. I think there is just so much richness in what you shared with the audience. So maybe let me start off by saying how very honored I am to have been invited to support the review. And once again, I want to emphasize the highly strategic nature of the engagement and the respite that informed the exchanges amongst all members of the expert panel that supported Public Safety Canada through this review. And the principal ambition, if I kind of were to sum it up in one sentence, has been truly to move from a cost management and cost of recovery to a philosophy of investment into resilience. This is a very fundamental shift. And given my professional mandate and experience being, in my role, responsible for developing partnership-based solutions between public and private sectors around the world, I just want to commend the Government of Canada for being really a lighthouse at this point in time in the approach. Acknowledging both the openness with which we were all invited to participate, the inclusivity throughout the entire process, as Becky said, but also the absolute complexity of dealing with the reality of Canada, which is a federal government with a huge sway of different population, risk perils, and obviously administrative complexity. So I think it is incredible that the government has embarked on this on this review. But it shouldn't be surprising for many of the audience that is coming from the insurance industry. You will have picked on topics of fiscal viability of the DFAA, and that's not dissimilar to conversations we would have within the insurance industry when we look at the risks that accumulate on our own balance sheets. And for the same drivers that Matthew highlighted, the urbanization, claim inflation, and obviously climate change, all contributing to how the losses are experienced over time, how quickly they escalate, and what are the points of intervention to maintain also a sustainable business model for ourselves. So the principles that I think come out of this review are clearly of accountability, much clearer accountability, clarity as to how the recovery can happen, what can be relied upon when moving from ex post accounting recognition of expenses to a clear reliability of where the support is going to come from. And that really drives an ability to program activities. So I would maybe like to move into my one singular slide, and then I think we're 4 minutes away from opening to the audience. I thought it'd be helpful maybe to share how this reform would have consequences, if any, from a high-level insurance industry perspective. I think it is, as I said, fundamentally demonstrating a risk management approach to the issue of disasters in the country and places resilience at the heart of this government agenda, with both an eye to financial and operational sustainability, and both in recognition of the frequency and the intensity of the events that are both changing. The second point that I think really should speak to the interest of the insurance industry is through this design of predictable, better allocated expenses, much more strategically informed interventions towards disaster risk reduction. We're looking at, with clarity, at enhanced availability and affordability of protection against uninsured risks. And as Matthew highlighted, the program does not conflict. In fact, it creates a very clear space for areas of partnership and intervention between the government and the insurance industry in developing solutions that allow for a much more balanced risk distribution, as, for example, the flood file that sees the industry in Canada being very active now for a couple of years, but could expand to also other perils. And I think it is, and it's therefore foundational, in my view, point to help develop more public-private partnerships that do use this risk allocation and risk mechanics, if you will, insurance-like solutions to create an augmentation to traditional insurance markets, which are otherwise well functioning. I think there is implicitly in the communication and the way Matthew presented, the work that public safety has embarked on. There is an implicit invitation that I see for us as an industry to be partners also in sharing analytics, experience, both internationally and domestically, to make sure that we all can be proactive contributors to resiliency of the country. Naturally, as data and information is better shared, and as we have a more continuous dialogue with the government, we should have, and I would say, feel invited to allow to build more risk-bearing capacity within the insurance industry, and potentially also help develop a different redistribution into the broader financial market, for instance, with capital market access and solutions that transfer it outside what may be the appropriate appetite within the industry itself. But what I love the most is this concept of building forward better. We always speak about building back better, but we like the idea of building forward because it really creates an environment in which investments can be made. And I think the insurance industry could also be a more dynamic partner in starting to capture adaptation and the improvements of new standards, of new building code standards in the way we price the risk. So in thinking more proactively about how insurance can be deployed also for adaptation purposes. In conclusion, I also want to say that the experience has been, for me personally, very rewarding. Naturally, we could only come with this coherent set of recommendations because we were listening to each other, and it was a very diverse team that Becky led for a number of months through a very, very deep set of dialogues. And so I think for me it was important to show an ability to contribute, but equally an ability to listen to different voices. And I hope as Public Safety Canada embarks on this journey of transformation of the FAA, we will continue to be good listeners and good contributors as an insurance industry. And I think the final consideration is I find we should be very proud that we have so much strategic insight as a sector. And it's very important that the breadth of and the holistic thinking that informs the way we run our own companies is made available through this dialogue ever more generously, because it is part of our collective social responsibility. In Canada is one of the most beautiful countries, if I can say so, both for its culture, for its industry, and for its insurance and financial sector. And I think, to be able to embark in a genuine and deep dialogue with the administration is not only an honor, but if you will, it's an honor for all of us to make sure that we are contributing in all possible facets to a stronger country and more resilient one. So with that, Keith, I maybe hand it over back to you.
Thank you very much. All right, so let's do some Q&A. I'm going to keep my camera off because of internet instability at my end. I'm sorry about that. I'll start with a question of my own, and I'll read you some of the attendees' questions. Tell us about the budget. What do you expect to be the annual costs of DFAA going forward, and how volatile do you think that's going to be?
I'll go first, I guess. So, I mean, we've been seeing a long-term increase, and as I mentioned, we seem to be seeing it happen in these stepped increases. And so I think that we would be fairly safe to assume that we're on a step right now of about $1 billion a year in federal costs, and that's been consistent over the last 5 or 6 years. I think that what we don't know is when the next stepped increase is going to happen. But if the current trend continues, we're going to be at this level and things will look stable for a few years. And then all of a sudden we'll start to see multi-billion-dollar events happening year over year across the country. And that certainly does add a lot of volatility into trying to keep the federal budget well predicted and well planned for. So far, we've been lucky. The biggest single events that we've seen have been to the tune of multi-billion dollars. So just under $4 billion for the floods in Calgary, about $5 billion, although that number may be coming down for the atmospheric river in 2021. These are big figures, but they're not catastrophically large for the entirety of the fiscal framework in Canada yet. But there are certainly scenarios that loom out there, like the West Coast seismic scenarios, that start to get scary in terms of that scale. And that volatility does sit and is something that we need to plan for, whether we have what looks like stability in the DFAA right now or not.
Anybody else have observations about the budget?
No, but I can just offer, Keith, that the most critical, that's why it becomes so important to shift from simply recovery mechanisms towards risk reduction. Investing in risk reduction is the only way, sensible way to get budget predictability.
That makes, go ahead, Becky.
And I would echo that from the provincial point of view. The province, of course, doesn't spend what the federal government spends, but the impact at the provincial level is just as great, given what it does spend. And to be able to invest that money into building back in a way that makes it more resilient is the only way to go. And it's very apparent on the ground here in British Columbia.
Let me keep going on that, on the point that Veronica just raised. I'm an American. I came to Canada a couple of years ago, so I have a lot of familiarity with FEMA and how it has been spending something on the order of $2 to $5 billion a year on mitigation, and finding that disaster costs nonetheless keep going up. And it seems that a likely reason for that is that $2 to $5 billion is orders of magnitude too small. That the mitigation need is orders of magnitude greater than $2 to $5 billion a year. So that enormous sum of money doesn't really make a difference. Do you have a sense of what Canada's need is for, if Canada were to spend every dollar, magically have all the money it needed to do all the mitigation that made sense, that was cost effective, or that otherwise fit into government's mission? How big is the need? And how does that compare with the kind of money that DFAA is preparing to invest in mitigation?
It's a good question, and I'll start with a couple caveats, which is we really don't have the level of sophistication in our data about previous events to give a rock solid answer. This is something we've looked very closely at, more from my academic background than from my current position within public safety. So I'll put this caveat as well. These are academic findings. These are not findings that come necessarily with the endorsement of the Government of Canada. But if you look at current costs for disasters from all of the cumulative data sets that we have, so disaster financial assistance, what the insurance industry has been spending, what we're able to glean that provinces and territories and the non-governmental sectors have been spending, and you forecast that out forward to 2050. And then you look at how you might be able to apply what FEMA and the National Institute of Building Sciences developed for return on investment for different hazard types. So they have a great report, which many of you are probably familiar with, that they originally published in 2007 and republished in 2019 with updated data. You apply those return on investment scenarios against what it looks like the trend line is currently pointing to. The gap that you get is about $15 billion per year between now and 2050 of necessary investments in mitigation, assuming that we stay on a fairly predictable curve for increases. So not like the step increases we've seen so far, but a much smoother curve. And that those investments go to places that give you that kind of ROI based on what FEMA's experience has been in making mitigation investments. It works out to about a $15 billion a year gap.
Wow, that's really interesting. Thank you.
Greg, can I build a little bit on Matthew's
Sure.
answer, because this is interesting. So we're hearing right for the next 30 years 15 billion, and I don't think that's actually I don't have a better quantified answer, but it seems very reasonable to me. And what it tells us is this is a very substantial investment, of course, but it's a necessary investment. But it's also an opportunity, I think, for the industry. If you look at the other side of the balance sheet, the way we manage our assets, if the country can come up with a program of investable projects, this could also be attractive for us to put money against. There are a number of conditions, of course, for big infrastructural projects. Obviously, the industry has an appetite. It matches the liability duration. And so it is a natural, if you will, good ALM strategy. And Canada has a very high credit rating. It's a very stable economy. So I would expect the international insurance industry to be keen to support projects of this nature in Canada. But even more so, I think that as part of the dialogue that I was hinting towards, to come up with mechanisms to help co-fund adaptation, which is severely underinvested from the private sector side. 98% of adaptation activities are funded by public pockets. So it's an opportunity right there to create new mechanisms. Not easy, but I do think it is an opportunity to also help create more economic activity within Canada that will, as Matt said, can produce tremendous benefit. There is a way of measuring these adaptation impacts. So sorry, it's a bit long as an answer, but I think it's part of how we haven't even started to have those conversations, but it'd be interesting to go there at some point.
Absolutely. I have a lot to say about that, but we're not here to listen to my questions and answers. Greg Steed says, I'm interested in your thoughts on the DFAA and this report when looking at it from the lens of the expected release and movement of the National Flood Reinsurance Program. My understanding is that that program would look to replace the DFAA.
Not at all, but Matthew, maybe you want to comment.
Yeah, I'll just sort of caveat the scope on that. So that program is really just for the highest risk residential flood damages. So it's probably somewhere between 6 and 10% of the residential building stock. And it would only be looking to help give a little bit of a boost to the rest of the residential flood insurance market, which is working well on its own. So it really is just for those highest risk properties. And what we're trying to get to is something that has been consistent in the DFAA for almost the entirety of the program, which is if something is reasonably insurable, we don't want to be competing through a public sector assistance program with the market that's working well. So this is really just trying to help that protection gap for those highest risk homes where you can't get affordable, adequate, and widely available insurance policies. It really doesn't touch the balance of the other expenditures under the DFAA. And just to give you a sense for flooding events, residential flood loss normally accounts for less than 15% of the total cost. It really is much more about public sector infrastructure and assets. So it's a small slice of a small slice that it's not a major shift. It's just us trying to correct for something that is not working perfectly in the market at present.
Great, thanks. Kevin McNeil asks, what might coherence between DFAA and ISC/CERNAC, CERNAC, I don't know what either of those acronyms mean, look like for First Nations? Can one of you explain what ISC/CERNAC means and then answer Tyrone's question?
I can give the acronyms, and I know that this was, there was a lot of good conversations on the panel about what coherence could or should look like. So maybe I'll kick it back to Becky and Veronica, but just to say Indigenous Services Canada is the government department that deals predominantly with Indigenous communities who are living on reserve. And they have a separate disaster assistance program called the Emergency Management Assistance Program, which is not exactly the same as the DFAA. The DFAA used to cover both on and off reserve communities until 2014. And then because it didn't seem to be working effectively for on reserve communities, there was a split that happened. But now there continues to be, I think, some challenges that were identified by the panel in the interface between those two programs. CERNAC is Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs. They deal with Indigenous communities that are self-governing or that live in Canada's north in the territories. So sort of a parallel department just based on whether it's on reserve or off reserve Indigenous communities that are being engaged.
Veronica, Becky, do you have any comments on the coherence issue?
I will just say, refer back to the recommendation that the panel put forward. You could tell from Matthew's answer that it's a Byzantine set of agencies that deal with First Nation and Indigenous disaster relief. And the panel urgently put to the federal government to find ways to make sure that there's fairness and equity in how disaster relief is treated. And I'm confident that a lot of that work is underway. It was even as we were meeting, and it wouldn't be in Matthew's wheelhouse. He may be aware of some of that work, but it was identified as an urgent need and put forward in the recommendations. Did you have something, Veronica?
Yeah, I think all I can add is exactly as Becky said, we recognize that there is different piping. I'm going to use a non-technical expression, but there is different piping through which the support will be channeled to different communities across Canada, and that's part of the federal and relationship nation to nation, and so it goes beyond, if you will, the ability of the expert panel to necessarily intervene in the details. But what we emphasized is exactly this concept of coherence and making sure that in like-for-like situation of vulnerability, populations get the same accessibility of the funds, equity in the treatment, and we emphasized the concept of vulnerability. We also debated, maybe we haven't touched upon this up until now, so it could be a good moment. We realized that there is differences in technical capacity across different communities. And one of the evidences that was brought to our attention is that the administrative burden of submitting requests in the middle of a disaster for the financial support through the DFAA felt somewhat, creating a disequity between different communities. So a part of the recommendations were about exactly what Matthew has highlighted earlier, a need to streamline, to drive efficiency, and to not let the process trump the objective of the policy. So we hope that these principles will be taken up also by other part of the government assistance mechanisms and maintain, if you will, that coherence across. But we do know that this is part of the complexity of the federal government. Please, Becky.
Add one other thing too, Keith. There's recognition on the panel that treating disaster mitigation and risk reduction through government borders is not exactly, it makes no sense if you're Mother Nature. That it makes more sense to work, like, say, in a watershed area and to reduce risk, or just as an example. And hopefully one of the ideas that Matt said is the policy changes that's occurring, where you would actually get credit for working together in a watershed area to mitigate flood risk and undertaking similar peril related bordered activities will also now count for something, even if it's for the sort of discount or rebate he was referring to when disaster does strike. So I don't know, Matt, if you can add anything to that perspective.
No, I mean, I think we're thinking more and more now about this idea of systems-based approaches. And so there's a couple ways you can slice the systems, and I think it's important that we go through all of them. One of them is the disaster risk reduction and emergency management system in Canada. So we really are trying to think about how we're creating appropriate incentives for all levels of government and all of the actors. So kind of like up and down and horizontally, but also, as you mentioned, just geographically. Like, it really doesn't make sense within a watershed not to think about how you're protecting against flooding in the entirety of the watershed, or in a seismically active region. Like, we really ought to be thinking beyond where the clean lines are on the maps that are human imposed, and think a little bit more about what's actually going to happen when the water starts to flow, or the earth starts to shake, or the wind starts to blow.
Okay. Josh McInnes asks, can you share what the expense types for the modernized DFAA will be, at least at this point? Will provinces and territories be responsible for any costs that exceed the limits set out for each given expense type?
So maybe the second part first, which is easier, and the first part second, which is a little bit more complex. So it's going to be a cost sharing percentage, not a flat cap. So it would be just like the existing DFAA. You would know that it would be a certain percentage that would be federal and a certain percentage that would be covered by the province and territory, regardless of how much the total amount is. So that's not going to change. It's not like it would be a dollars and cents cap here. It would be a percentage. So that shouldn't put any undue burden on provinces. One thing that Minister Blair was very clear about, and that we've been able to remain true to throughout the process, is there's no intention for this to be a process of downloading additional costs to provinces and territories. It should be either the same amount of cost sharing across jurisdictions, just funded and flowed differently, or a net increase of the federal share. So this is not an exercise to try to reduce the federal exposure under the program. In terms of the categories, this was something that we had a very clear sense of how we were planning to develop these categories. And when we went province to province, one of the things that we did over the course of the summer was develop a human-centered design workshop to help flesh out how we would do these categories. And after the first workshop in Ontario, we realized that all of our preconceived notions were fundamentally flawed. And we had to go back to the drawing board, and we've been working with provinces and territories to figure out how best to do this. So I can tell you what didn't work well when we got into it was trying to use like time to be the biggest determinant of whether something would be a response cost or a recovery or reconstruction cost. And what we learned over the course of the engagement in the summer is like time, there is no magical time at which point a community is done its response phase or when it's done its recovery phase. You really need to create the openness for the policy objectives to drive the work, regardless of whether they happen the day after the disaster or 2 weeks after or 2 months after. So we've been, I think we've tried to be a lot more open in the ways that we're conceptualizing those categories now. They are things that we're still working with provinces and territories to try to land. So I don't have an intelligent answer for you on what they're ultimately going to look like. We just learned, I think, a lot over the course of the conversations in the summer about where we might be inadvertently creating challenges if we were to proceed with our initial intuitions. So as soon as we have those, we're hoping to be able to share them, as I mentioned, at latest early next calendar year. But we do want to give ourselves the space to try to come up with the categories that are going to work best for different levels of government.
Okay.
I just want to interject, Keith. Matt, thanks again to you and your team for actually listening. I mean, this is yet another example, remarkable example of how these conversations are actually shaping things so that we have an even better chance of actually reducing risk. And much appreciated. It's such a relief to hear you say that.
Tyrone, I'm going to come back to your additional questions after I get through one from Angela, who hasn't asked before. Angela Keller-Herzog asks, will the new federal regime have ways to connect to the municipal level directly? A lot of the critical infrastructure is located in urban centers with other immediate spending priorities.
So this is actually one of the pieces that's laid out in legislation. So within the Emergency Management Act, there's a necessity for us to deliver disaster assistance to the province and for the province to be the interface with local governments. We've seen some federal program like the Disaster Mitigation and Adaptation Fund and some of the other infrastructure programs where the federal government has been engaging directly with municipalities and local governments. We just don't have that flexibility under this program. And I think given that systems level perspective, there are good reasons also that we would want to continue to go through the province so that they can have that sort of broader perspective. So this is something that legislatively would have had to have changed for us to be able to do it. We didn't do that both because we weren't given the opportunity to amend the legislation. And I think that there are good reasons of coherence why you would still want the province to be able to help deliver that broader systems-based perspective.
Awesome, thanks. Ernesto Rodriguez says, hoping that Public Safety Canada elaborate a guide for a transboundary risk management. Not quite sure what the question there is. Matt, are you going to create a guide for transboundary risk management?
Yeah, I mean, that's really our intention, is start to come up with some more doctrine that lays out this systems-based approach. And, the federal government is fairly limited in the tools that we have to compel local governments or provinces to manage risk in very specific ways. So I think what you'll see from us, hopefully going forward, is a lot more just like examples and rationale for why these things we think could work quite effectively for all the reasons that I've talked about so far and Becky alluded to as well. Like, we really need, I think, to be thinking differently about how we're managing risk, not just across jurisdictional lines, but really across the systems that make sense, the up-down whole of society system, and also the actual ground watershed, all of the places that the water goes, because it really doesn't seem to have appropriate passports to stop itself at international borders or anywhere else.
Keith, if you don't mind, Veronica, do you know of examples of systems to make that work in other countries?
No, but it is a common issue every time you are, and everyone is abutting, unless you're a small island state, you are bound to share borders with others. if it is of any help, for instance, as an insurance reinsurance company, when we look at the earthquake risk, as Matt was describing it before, let's say on the western side of Canada, we don't draw a line. We consider everything all the way into the US because, you know, geologically speaking, that's the way the fault falls. And we need to think of accumulation of risks across. It's the same thing for tropical cyclone in North America. It starts, you know, from part of the Caribbean and it goes all the way to North America and Canada, US. You know, it's a very similar approach. You don't use the geographic boundaries as in jurisdiction, but you have to think of the phenomenon as it manifests itself. And then, of course, the more you go across country, nations, or states, you'll find that conversation to become a little bit more complicated. But I believe, for instance, this is something that happens around the Ontario Lake, and I don't know. You'll be more attuned to how this is managed across the U.S. and the Canadian border, where the water level needs to be controlled, obviously, and there is managed release of the waters, and that's something that can be done. To me, that's an example of how you do it. Once you know that there is a certain accumulation. And maybe the only thought I can add is that a lot of what we're describing today, with the exception of an earthquake, with the data that we have, with the science that we have, with the ability to track natural phenomenon and predict them, is highly manageable. This is part of a responsible response mechanism. So it takes effort, but the ability to actually coordinate is certainly there, if one is willing to put that effort in. And the resiliency outcome of that is actually manifold, because we end up having so much less disruption, losses, and damage once we coordinate smartly.
And just really briefly, I know we do have things like the IJC, the International Joint Commission for Canada-US Transboundary Waterways. I think where we're looking at other perils, or where we're even looking at like intra-national borders, there I think it's less consistent. And so just trying to, like I said, put forward examples in the strongest possible case for why we should be shifting towards that systems-based approach.
So I just think it's an excellent question, because the bottom line is we've developed a habit of more navel gazing, because that's where the rewards came in through the DFAA, just as an example. And now to begin to look to consciously move toward managing against peril and learning how to coordinate with these new technologies and data, and working across, of course, governments are concerned with their boundaries, but big insurance companies that have properties across those boundaries will have methods that perhaps could be shared and approaches that could be shared. So yeah, it's time for us to migrate to a new approach to risk mitigation, and doing it together is the way to build forward best.
But isn't DFAA largely reactive? I mean, it's a pot of money that provinces and territories can call on, and you've offered greater flexibility, and you're going to try to streamline the process for, partly for less advantaged provinces and territories. But you haven't said anything about, sort of DFAA being somehow actively involved in selecting driving mitigation. It's a resource for mitigation, but is there any sense in which, DFAA, I don't know, executives or administrators are helping, say, to drive the building code toward better construction, or to advocate for better, more resilient design of utilities and transportation infrastructure? Is there any push to policy push from DFAA toward more resilient infrastructure?
So I think the important thing to note is that the DFAA is only one part of the puzzle. So it can't do everything, unfortunately. And Because we did not change the legislation under which the program is triggered, it's only triggered after an event. So that part for this program in particular is just like crystal clear. It can't work in the anticipatory pre-disaster space. It has to be post-disaster. It doesn't mean that we as a federal government and in collaboration with provinces and territories aren't looking at other funding incentive program or other funding programs to make those investments in upfront mitigation. Because we are. And so things like the Disaster Mitigation and Adaptation Fund is sort of the anticipatory program through which we make those investments upfront before the disaster happens. Where I think the systems-based approach from a policy perspective is really important is under the Disaster Mitigation and Adaptation Fund, that upfront program, the cost sharing percentages top out at a much lower level than what you would get from the DFAA. And part of what we heard from provinces and territories is in some cases, local governments have done the math and said, well, we could spend the money up front and get, I don't know, 50-50 cost sharing ratio. But if we wait until something bad happens, then we'll get a 90-10, potentially a 90-10 cost sharing percentage with an additional 15% on top of that to do the work. So that's where the coherence across programs becomes really important, is we need to make sure that we're not inadvertently incentivizing people to wait, because there's no more expensive way to mitigate the risk than to incur all of the damages, build it all back and then protect it. So we really want to make sure that the handshake across different federal investment programs makes sense and that those incentives are pushing in the right direction. Lastly, I'll just say that there is an incentivization both for building codes, but also for these disaster and climate resilient guidelines for us to push for increasing development of those kinds of well-informed, well-researched standards and guidelines, and that we are using the DFAA to reward the development and adoption of those at a provincial and territorial level. So even though we can't formally play in the pre-disaster space, I do think that there are things that we're trying to do, and we're trying to be as creative as we can and still creating an incentive system through the DFAA that continues to complement the other big programs to push in the appropriate directions. So again, DFAA, it's only in the post-disaster space. It can't do everything, but we are trying to make sure it plays well with other programs and pushes incentives in the right direction, and even within the new program terms and conditions, reinforces those appropriate incentives.
Thanks. Tyrone McNeil asks, does the understanding of resilience in this process start where the current development is relative to high-risk flood areas, including dikes? Or alternatively, and as I prefer, or as he prefers, resilience resets the placement of development and dikes to better ensure long-term resilience? Is there room for managed retreat in this understanding of resilience?
Yeah, maybe I'll start it, Matt, and then because you'll have the politically correct answer. But I think we discussed it as a group of panelists. We do believe there is on occasion, the most effective measure is managed retreat. And I think what you'll see in the recommendations that Matt anticipated is this importance of conditionality. So if there is a decision to continue to maintain presence in particularly hazardous areas, we better be very conscious and intentional in the way we put any assets in those areas. It isn't just about the exposure or the peril, it's about the vulnerability. So to make sure that whatever assets are put and built in a physically hazardous and known to be hazardous areas, to make sure that these are designed and constructed and tested to be resilient to shocks that are going to come is a responsibility that we all have, right? It's not a nice to have. It has to be condition sine qua non for investments. So this is how I answer. If I were to invest in a certain area, I would want to ask those questions before I put money in. But Matt, you can give the qualified answer, which is from the government. I'm just a simple investor here.
And yeah, I apologize, both Veronica, to you and Becky. I realize I'm talking for more than my share of these, so I'll try to get through this one quickly and then hopefully give more time to you. So one of the things that you would see, we did not the panel on the DFAA, but we did a interdisciplinary task force on flood insurance. And they did a whole bunch of different types of modeling. And one of the things that we learned from the modeling, because we did ask this question about managed retreat, is just how much real estate is in the highest risk areas across the country. And it's, you know, tens of billions of dollars. So there's a lot there to think about. So the scale of the potential for managed retreat was much bigger than what we thought at the outset of that work. Managed retreat is an eligible expense under the DFAA today, and our anticipation would be that it would continue to be eligible and we would provide more flexibility. The other thing that we've looked at is we brought in a number of behavioral economists to help us just think through how you would help to create the incentive for people to accept managed retreat where their annual loss from events was just like guaranteed to keep going up into the future to either unmanageable levels today or unmanageable levels soon. And it just turns out that psychologically, it's also a very complex process. So that also put a little bit of water on the fire that we had going on managed retreat, at least as a short-term solution. And the last thing I'll say about it is I think that when we're thinking about the ethics of managed retreat, a really important component is prior informed consent about levels of risk. And across Canada, many people and many businesses who are purchasing properties, they don't have access to up-to-date flood or other hazard maps. And so they really didn't know when they made the investment. And so then I think that that has an implication as well for how hard we pull on the lever of managed retreat, recognizing that in the past, many people just didn't know the level of risk through no fault of their own before they purchased. So just trying to be respectful of that. I think going forward, one of the reasons we're pushing so hard to get the modeling work that we've been doing into the hands of Canadians is so that that prior informed consent exists, so that we can provide a little bit of a reset and say, listen, we need to deal with the infrastructure that is currently exposed, that has been developed. But going forward, we need to think a lot more strategically about where we're putting things, because it doesn't seem like the trends that are driving disaster impact are going away. So let's be smart about this and let's put resilience at the forefront. And there are many ways in which that's going to provide us a high return on investment, not just in averted losses, but for other types of resilience dividends as well. So let's certainly reset as we're thinking about where we're going to develop into the future.
Thanks. Walter Tingley asks, where is Canada with regard to having a national stormwater management system?
So if we're talking about stormwater in terms of like urban stormwater, that's one of the areas that is a jurisdictional area of local governments. So I think that this is something where it would be a good test case for us to talk about what a systems-based approach would look like across an entire watershed, because I think many of the watersheds where we would have concerns about stormwater management would cross multiple local governments and in most cases cross provincial and territorial boundaries as well. So this is an area that I wouldn't say we have a specific maturity where there is something coming forward at any point in the near future. I do think it's a good case study, though, for the kind of systems-based approach that we think is most effective.
Thanks. Greg Steed says, I apologize if I missed this earlier, but was it commented on if the DFAA was going to set a lifetime limit on the properties and their ability to use DFAA?
It wasn't commented on. This is something that we've seen more from provinces and territories. So as I mentioned, there's the federal terms and conditions for this program, which tend to be a little bit more open. And then provinces and territories kind of develop their own shadow or parallel programs through which local governments and individuals access funding. There's a number of jurisdictions, especially after recent large events, that are starting to put lifetime caps on different types of infrastructure. So I know Quebec, after the 2017 and 2019 flooding events, started to take a close look at this. Likewise in Alberta after the 2013 floods. So it is a trend that we're seeing creeping up more and more. So how we decide to take a more coherent national-based approach or give that flexibility into provinces, I think is an ongoing conversation. But it certainly is a trend that we've seen creeping up. And like I said, especially after really large-scale events, we have seen a proliferation of those kinds of caps.
Here's a question from me. Matt, you talked about building back better, and I think Veronica complemented the concept, especially the new phraseology. Did provinces and territories say they wanted to do that? You know, did you get a lot of push from provinces and territories saying, you know, we would really like to build forward better?
Becky, I don't know if you want to pick that one up just from some of your old hats that you may still have lying around.
Yeah, well, and I'll be really interested to hear what you heard as you traveled around the country. But I can say in BC, building forward better has long been on the mind there of the public service and of many of the municipalities and regional districts in BC. You get burnt out and flooded within 3 months of each other in a small community. They're very interested in being able to take steps to prevent it from happening again. And particularly at the provincial level, a lot of the infrastructure that relates to the transportation network, for instance, would benefit from having larger culverts put into place, but the DFAA would only provide for the same size culvert to be put back. So that's just a really simple example of where BC went ahead and did the investment on its own. But as that becomes eligible then, and DFAA financing, that'll help the province to make its transportation infrastructure more resilient, bridge abutments, things like that. Those all fall into that category. But as usual, a lot of it falls on local governments too, where they may be replacing their own stormwater systems and things like that. So there's been a big focus on that for a long time. I'm very glad to see it coming. But I am maybe curious to hear. Yeah, sorry, Veronica.
No, I just wanted to say I'm obviously not Canadian, but I have a vivid recollection of our 3 calls as part of the advisory panel consultation. And what really stayed with me is, this sounds very good, but please give us visibility for the longer term. So I think while I completely agree with Matt that the DFAA is not solve it all, do it all, there is this ability to have a reliable system of interfacing between the federal government and the provincial intervention, and this ability to program activities is what I hope is going to characterize, the dialogue going forward as well, because there is a liquidity consideration, I think, that the provinces expressed, the ability to claim back over a reasonable time frame, and what does that mean to their fiscal allocation of funds, et cetera, and maybe money coming only 4 or 5 years later. This ability to have certainty that the support is going to come, and that with this new important, I would say, may seem like a small twist, but I think it's a major shift in the DFAA towards creating accelerated incentive for those who make the right choices. We're really establishing conditions for a long-term alignment. So I would expect the provinces to love what Matt has just shared with us on the call today, because it's responding to the request for predictability, visibility, alignment, and liquidity to do the things that they want to do, but knowing that they're doing it in partnership with the federal government.
Great, thanks. Tyrone McNeil asks, how much is Canada leveraging the insurance and reinsurance models? They use more recent data to run models where government tends to use data a century or more old, which isn't really relevant in the state of climate change we're in.
Yeah, I mean, this is the big shift for us. We had been relying up until a couple of years ago almost exclusively on regulatory flood maps. So I'll speak just to flooding because this is where I think we've made some of the best progress, but I can speak also to a couple of other parallel areas. But certainly in flooding, like, we just didn't have a coherent national view on the total flood risk exposure of the country. And that's because the flood maps were being done by the federal government with provinces and by local governments in ways that were not coherent and not consistently invested in over time. And so we had regulatory flood maps for less than 2% of the Canadian landmass. And there's been a number of studies conducted through ICLR and through the University of Waterloo and elsewhere, looking at the quality and recency of those maps. And in many cases, they're older than I am. So a lot, you can imagine, has changed in development patterns in those communities. So we've been leveraging the international reinsurance and catastrophe modeling based approaches. What we did when we proceeded with the task force on flood insurance was go out and purchase every model that existed, and then did an ensemble approach to try to pull all of those together along with different damage ratios and depth damage functions from different sources as well, to try to get the best the best picture that we could. And that was calibrated against the existing regulatory maps where we could do that. So that certainly is where we see the trend seeming to be going. It looks like, based on some of what we've been hearing from international allies, in some cases, those global type models are outperforming locally developed regulatory maps. So I think if you were looking out the next 5 or 10 years, you would probably see that those approaches, given improvements in remote sensing data and just in machine learning capabilities, I could imagine a future in which those actually outperform the regulatory maps at some point in the not too distant future. So that certainly is where we're going on the flood side. Likewise on the seismic side as well. Some of the areas where we're still trying to figure out whether that type of probabilistic modeling could work and would be appropriate are on things like wildland urban interface fire and permafrost thaw. But I think that the technology is continuing to develop in exciting ways on that front as well. But Veronica, you must know much more about this than I do.
No, that's the perfect answer, and it's true. I think the industry is making strides in this less research, actually much more complex risks around wildfires and urban and wild interface. And as you said, the permafrost is going to be the next horizon. But there are exciting collaborations. Ourselves, we entered a partnership with Google X, for instance, to work specifically on wildfire, because we know that there is a lot of unmet demand, and at the moment it's extremely difficult to correctly price this type of exposure, and then to do the proper accumulation analysis and develop covers that we can stand behind over time. So it's a work in progress for all of us, but I think ever more important that we keep this dialogue really open, and we make anything that is new and available and reliable put it in the hands of government. I am convinced, because government takes effectively over 70% of the risks related to natural catastrophes on average around the world. This is, again, it's in our collective interest to share the knowledge and the expertise.
Do you anticipate any of those models becoming visible to the general public? I'm thinking of, for instance, flood factor, a product of risk factor, and how in the United States you can put in your address and you can see a very dynamic picture of your flood risk at an address level without any, even if it's outside of the FEMA mapped floodplain. Do you anticipate government making commercial models visible to the public?
Yeah, so that's certainly our intention. So one of the platform commitments from the government that we've now been funded for is to develop a flood risk portal for Canadians for exactly that purpose. So we're working quite closely with folks at Flood Factor and a number of other companies as well to try to figure out what the most appropriate way to do that in Canada is, recognizing that there's going to be an interface between what the models say and what the regulatory maps say, sometimes for good reason and sometimes for not good or not easy to explain reasons. So there's also a bit of like intergovernmental negotiation that has to happen to ensure that as we're doing this in ways that work well for us and work well for other levels of government and for Canadians. But that certainly is the intent, is in the next few years to work towards that kind of model, so that we can have that prior informed consent that I spoke about earlier. Like we keep wanting Canadians to take risk appropriate decisions and make good decisions and make the kinds of investments we want them to make. Well, the necessary precursor for that is then having access to the risk information. And that's a big gap that we've not been able to close until very recently.
Keith, if I can only add, definitely that's the case in the US, but this is becoming actually a more widespread approach around the world. New Zealand did the same. Australia is looking in a similar approach. So, I really do think this is part of how you keep the population aware and alerted and co-responsible for these decisions. The more challenging question will be, once the portal are live, how is the availability of this information going to be disseminated? Will people care to go and look it up? So there is a whole behavioral science that needs to accompany the process, and maybe not smart of me to say, but clearly we need to, there has to be a strategy of communication that doesn't create panic amongst the population. It's like, oh, I'm in, a flood area now, so what happens to me? This has to be accompanied with, as you said, Matt, with co-responsibility with the municipalities, et cetera, et cetera. So I can see that in many cases, not in Canada, Canadians are courageous, but in many cases, this is a very sensitive topic. But I think there is the recognition overall that protection of the population and informing decision is, they're both, higher priorities than dealing with the consequences of choices of the past. But maybe we're not as well informed.
Thank you so much. There are more questions, but sorry, Becky, we are out of time. I want to thank all three of you for giving your time, giving this great talk. And I want to remind everybody that that we will make the video of this webinar available online by Monday at www.iclr.org/workshops, and you'll also be able to download a PDF of the speakers' decks. Remember, join us next time on November 10th, when Christian Messier will speak about how to increase the resilience of urban trees to climate change and other threats. Thanks very much, everybody.